Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at a proposed resource deal between the U.S. and Ukraine, a story that's developing pretty rapidly and has some big international implications. And yeah, buckle up because we're going to break down the details of the proposed deal, see how the U.S. and Ukraine are presenting things differently.
Yeah, I like that. Having these different angles on the same event is what makes these deep dives so valuable.
I totally agree. So to set the scene, the U.S. is interested in getting access to a lot of Ukraine's natural resources. We're talking minerals, gas, oil, even potential revenue from things like ports and infrastructure. It's pretty wide range. And get this, the initial proposal from the U.S. was for a $500 billion fund. $500 billion, with Ukraine putting in the resources, but the U.S. having total control.
Now, the U.S. claims that having this kind of control would actually increase transparency
Right.
and, help prevent corruption, and that ultimately the profits would be reinvested back into Ukraine. But this proposal has definitely raised some eyebrows.
Yeah, you can say that again. And to make things even more complicated, there's a huge difference in how the U.S. and Ukraine are talking about the aid that's already been provided.
Yeah.
Trump says the U.S. has given $350 billion, but Zelensky's saying it's actually $67 billion in weapons and $31.5 billion in financial aid. That's a massive difference.
Oh, yeah, it is. It really is. And this kind of discrepancy makes you wonder about the motivations behind this deal, right? I mean, it's no secret that the U.S. is really interested in securing sources of rare earth elements, which, are crucial for all sorts of technologies. We're talking everything from smartphones to military equipment and renewable energy. These elements are strategically important. And guess what? Ukraine happens to have them. So is this deal actually about helping Ukraine rebuild? Or is it about the U.S. trying to lock down access to these resources?
That's the big question, isn't it? And it looks like Ukraine is kind of pushing back, too. They countered with a proposal for a $100 billion fund instead, quite a bit lower, and even requested a direct meeting between Zelensky and Trump. It seems like they're not just going to accept whatever the U.S. puts on the table.
They're definitely asserting themselves in this negotiation, which is interesting, especially when we bring in the Turkish perspective. Now, Cumhuriyet doesn't hold back. They call out the U.S. for treating Ukraine like they actually use the term pawn, to exploit its resources and push its own agenda. They also claim that the U.S. is trying to cut Ukraine out of the peace negotiation process, which is a pretty serious accusation.
Wow, so Cumhuriyet is painting a much more cynical picture of U.S. intentions here. They seem to be saying that this isn't really about helping Ukraine at all, but about the U.S. pursuing its own interest, potentially at Ukraine's expense. And it gets even more specific when they talk about Zelensky.
Yeah, what do they say about Zelensky?
Well, Cumhuriyet accuses Zelensky of basically being manipulated by Western powers, first by the UK and now by the US. They even mention that Zelensky has claimed peace negotiations were shut down because of pressure from the CIA and MI6.
Whoa. That's a pretty big claim. Now, whether there's any truth to that is hard to say, but it definitely raises some important questions about how much agency Zelensky really has in this situation. Is he actually making decisions that are best for Ukraine, or is he being pressured into following someone else's playbook?
That's what we need to figure out.
Yeah.
And if that's the case, then what does that say about how the U.S. views its role in this whole conflict?
Right. And how does this potential deal fit into the broader picture of U.S.-Russia relations?
You're seeing some pretty strong opinions here, and I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on all of this. What do you make of these totally contrasting viewpoints, and what do you think this deal could actually mean for Ukraine and for the global landscape?
Well, it's clear that this proposed deal, if it actually goes through, has the potential to really shake things up.
Absolutely. It's definitely a complex situation with a lot of moving parts. We've got those conflicting numbers on aid, this potential power dynamic between the U.S. and Ukraine, and then that really critical Turkish perspective to think about.
It's true, and that's why it's so important to consider all these different viewpoints. It's not about just accepting one narrative over another, but about understanding how each perspective adds to the overall picture.
I like that. So we've laid out the basics of the deal, and we've heard some pretty different takes on it. Now, let's dig a little deeper into the potential impact of this deal on the countries involved.
Okay, let's do it. If the U.S. manages to secure access to these resources from Ukraine, it could have a big impact, both economically and strategically.
Yeah, that makes sense. Initial U.S. proposal for a $500 billion fund with the U.S. in complete control didn't exactly go over well in Ukraine.
Yeah. That's understandable. Having a foreign power basically controlling such a huge chunk of your resources and infrastructure is bound to raise concerns. Concerns about your country's sovereignty and the potential for exploitation. Ukraine's counterproposal for a $100 billion fund and their insistence on a meeting between Zelensky and Trump shows that they're not going to be pushed around. They're aiming for a more balanced arrangement.
And then there's that Turkish publication, Cumhuriyet, taking a much harsher stance. They're arguing that the U.S. is essentially using Ukraine to further its own goals on the world stage.
Right. They even went as far as to accuse the U.S. of exploiting Ukraine's resources and trying to sideline them in the peace negotiation process. Their perspective really highlights the power dynamics at play here and how smaller countries can get caught in the middle when bigger powers are pursuing their own agendas.
And Cumhuriyet was pretty harsh in their assessment of Zelensky, too. They're claiming that he's being manipulated by Western powers.
Is he truly making choices that benefit Ukraine? Or is he being influenced by these external forces? It really feeds into this narrative of Ukraine being stuck between a rock and a hard place, trying to rebuild their country while also dealing with pressure from powerful allies.
Yeah, and don't forget about those conflicting accounts of the aid provided that we talked about earlier.
Right.
Trump claims it's $350 billion, but Zelensky says it's significantly lower.
Yeah, those numbers are hard to ignore. It's tough to know for sure who's presenting the most accurate information, but it definitely highlights how important it is to be critical of the information we're getting and to consider all sides of the story in these complicated situations.
This all makes international relations seem really grim. It feels like it's all about power struggles, manipulation, and taking advantage of others.
It's certainly not simple. International relations rarely are. There are often competing interests at play and hidden motives, and a lot going on behind the scenes that we just don't see. The important thing is to be aware of those complexities and to approach these kinds of situations with a critical eye.
I agree. And I think that's where the Turkish perspective from Cumhuriyet is so valuable. It's giving us a totally different take.
And it's by looking at these contrasting viewpoints that we can start to put together a more complete understanding of what's actually going on. It's not about blindly believing one side or the other, but about considering all the information we have and forming our own conclusions.
It's like solving a puzzle. But we're missing some of the pieces. We have information, but there are still gaps. And we need to keep digging, keep asking questions, and keep looking for those missing pieces to get a clearer picture.
That's a great way to put it. And as we do that, it's important to remember that these geopolitical maneuvers have real-world consequences. The choices made by powerful leaders and the agreements reached between nations can have a profound impact on people's lives.
Yeah. What I'm taking away from all of this is that there's always more to the story than what we see on the surface, especially when it comes to international relations. We need to be careful at accepting any one narrative as the whole truth and be open to exploring different perspectives to really understand what's happening.
I completely agree. That's what it means to think critically and engage with the world around us.
So where do we go from here? We've examined the details of the proposed deal, analyzed the reactions to it, and even ventured into the realm of geopolitical speculation.
I think the next step is to think about the bigger implications. How might this deal, if it actually happens, reshape the global landscape? What does it tell us about U.S. foreign policy right now and how they're approaching post-conflict reconstruction?
And what does the future hold for Ukraine as they navigate this incredibly delicate situation? They're stuck in the middle of a power struggle, trying to rebuild their nation while also being sought after for their valuable resources. It's a tough spot to be in.
Yeah, those are really important questions, but they're worth grappling with. After all, the decisions being made today are going to shape the world of tomorrow.
You know, there's something that's been on my mind throughout this whole discussion. It wasn't directly addressed in the sources we looked at, but it feels incredibly relevant.
Oh, I'm intrigued. What is it?
Well, we've been focusing on the economic and geopolitical aspects of this proposed deal. But what about the people actually living in Ukraine? What about their perspective?
Ah, yes. That's a crucial point. It's easy to get caught up in the big picture negotiations and power plays, but we can't forget that there are real people whose lives are being affected by these decisions.
Exactly. Think about the Ukrainians who have already been through so much. How will this deal, if it happens, impact their lives, their livelihoods, their hopes for the future?
It's a question that deserves much more attention. We need to look beyond the numbers and the geopolitical chessboard and really consider the impact on the people on the ground.
I'm also concerned about the potential for corruption. The U.S. has been saying that this deal is a way to make things more transparent and prevent corruption. But is that realistic? Ukraine has a history of corruption, And even with the U.S. supposedly in control, how can we be sure that those resources will be used ethically and for the benefit of the Ukrainian people?
That's a valid concern. Corruption is a complex issue, and it's not something that can be easily solved, even with good intentions. It takes systemic change, strong institutions, and a culture of accountability. It's something that needs to be carefully considered and monitored.
What I'm getting at is that while we're examining the intricacies of this deal, we can't forget about the people at the heart of it all. The people of Ukraine aren't just pieces on a chessboard. They're individuals with hopes, dreams, and aspirations for a better future.
Absolutely. Their voices and perspectives need to be heard and considered as these decisions are being made.
So as we continue to follow this story, let's keep that in mind.
I agree. It's an essential part of understanding the full picture.
This deep dive has definitely given us a lot to think about. We've uncovered so much information, explored different viewpoints, and raised some important questions.
It's been fascinating to explore the complexity of international relations and this delicate balance between national interests, global power dynamics, and the well-being of individuals caught in the middle of it all.
We've given our listeners a lot to ponder, and I'm eager to hear their thoughts. What stands out to them? What parts of this deal do they find most concerning or intriguing?
Yeah, we really want to hear their perspectives and insights. After all, this is a story that affects all of us in one way or another.
This deep dive has been a journey of discovery, and I have a feeling there are many more twists and turns to come as the story unfolds.
Indeed. The world is constantly changing, and it's through these explorations that we can better understand the forces shaping our present and our future.
So, until our next deep dive, stay curious and keep exploring.
And always remember to keep questioning, keep learning, and keep searching for the truth, wherever it may lead.
Before we wrap up, I want to remind our listeners that we're here to make things clear. We break down complex topics, explore multiple perspectives, and strive to deliver insightful analysis that helps you navigate our ever-changing world.
And we love hearing from you. Your thoughts, your questions, your insights, they all contribute to the richness of this conversation.
So don't be shy. Reach out to us on social media, leave us a comment, or send us an email. We're always eager to connect with our fellow deep divers.
And don't forget to subscribe to our podcast, available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube.
We're here every day with new episodes, exploring the most fascinating and thought-provoking stories from around the globe.
So join us on this journey of discovery. We promise it's a deep dive worth taking.